Many of you are familiar with the term the rapture or the second coming or the end times or eschatology. And many of you have read chapter 24 a lot, focused on it, studied it. But have you read chapter 23? Today we're going to be talking about this generation, because while we do not purport to ever, based on what God himself said, know when the rapture, when the second coming is going to happen, we need to discuss what leads us to believe when it will happen-ish, like such as, will it happen? Did it happen 2,000 years ago? Is it going to happen? Did it happen in 50 AD? Is it going to happen in 2000 something? It matters. So first, let's look at chapter 23. Well, most Christians read chapter 23. They don't probably pay a lot of attention to it or how it relates to Matthew chapter 4, at least not to a great extent. So Matthew chapter 23, Jesus and his disciples are in the temple with the Pharisees. And Jesus is saying, Pharisees, you're a bunch of hypocrites and blind guides, and you have stupid standards that you can't meet, no one else can meet. And you're ignoring Jesus coming, you're ignoring my coming, and you're going to crucify God. You and several people are going to let this happen or make it happen. And he says in chapter 36, or verse 36, chapter 23 of Matthew, verse 36, and it's written, both of these chapters are related somewhat or even in greater detail in two other chapters. But we focus on this one more than any. So Jesus says to them, now this generation is going to have all of this come upon them, because bad things come upon them, because they ignored the coming of the Lord of glory. So when he's saying this generation, and we look in the Greek, what is the word that he says he uses? He uses the word genea. Genea can mean a race of people, but more specifically, much more often, it means like a group of people. So he says this generation is going to be cursed, and he's talking to those people that live at that time, or live within, just to be fair, to be really, really moderate, we're going to say within 100 years of when he's speaking, within 100 years. But it can't be more than that. He's saying, you guys in this generation, this genea. Another word for generation is pergogi, but it is, I think that's how you pronounce it, but it is not used here. It is genea. Now, what word does Jesus ever use in the New Testament? The word generation. Now, in Matthew chapter 24, let's continue on, and we're going to look at genea there. So in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus has been disgusted by the Pharisees, and he's left the temple. And the disciples come up to him to kind of placate him, and whatever the case is exactly, they say, when's your coming, and when's the not the second coming, what is the sign of your return? What is the sign of the end of the age? And when is this temple going to be destroyed? Because Jesus also says that's going to happen. And Jesus tells them there's going to be a bunch of things that are going to happen. And then, right leading up to the temple being destroyed, there's going to be certain really obvious signs that you see. And when you see those certain really obvious signs, then you have to run to the mountains. That's a term we use, but he actually meant run to the mountains. They ran to these mountains called Pella or something like that. And he said, that's how you will be saved, because he said, you're going to see the abomination of desolation standing where it shouldn't be. So something most likely in the temple, you're going to see that, and it's going to be really bad. So run to the mountains. You'll see signs, you'll see earthquakes and that. And don't even, once you see all this stuff happen, He said, when you see this abomination of desolation, then he said, don't even go back for your coat. Don't do anything. Just take off for the mountains. So that's what he's telling them up to verse, Matthew chapter 24, verse 34. He's saying all of this. And he finishes in verse 34 by saying, this generation will not pass away until some of you have seen this happen. Now, in this generation, that's where the issue comes. Many people assume that a generation isn't necessarily a literal generation like it was in the previous chapter. It is a different meaning, and it might mean a completely distant generation. That's what it might mean. But let's look at the Greek word. The Greek word that is used there, is it even the same as the word that was used in chapter 23 to describe the Pharisees' generation? Well, if we were going to go with the idea of this generation that's spoken of in Matthew chapter 4 actually being a different kind of generation, actually referring to like a race of people that live way in the future, something like that, then we would expect the words to be different. Would we not? Okay, so let me put this interesting piece of information to you. The word pergogi, which we think might be used, the other one was genea, and this might be pergogi. It's not used. It's still the word genea. So chapter 23 talks about this genea. Chapter 24 talks about this genea. One includes the Pharisees. Admittedly, one does not include the Pharisees exactly, but this generation, it's literal. Jesus is speaking to this literal generation, the generation, like not my literal generation, but his literal generation. And he used the word this at the time because it was this generation that was happening right now. Like this generation that I'm in is, I'm not specific. It's the 2000s, and the generation that I'm born in, which would still be within like 100 years, but a generation is usually between 20 and 40 years ish. This generation, my generation, is millennial. I believe I'm a millennial. So this generation, if the words are the same in both chapters, do you think they have different meanings in the two different chapters? Do you even think it's possible for them to have two different meanings? Because if it was a different meaning, would it not have to be the word maybe that's used for generation in another sense, such as pergogi? So see, the words, whether looking at the Greek, whether or not we take into account which Greek words are used all the time and are different, even though for us it's just the word generation. And it can mean multiple things, but Greek was very specific. It was either talking about. So what is your take? Maybe you weren't familiar with the fact that Jesus is speaking to this the words that we translate as this generation are the same in both chapter 23 of Matthew and chapter 24 of Matthew. So if you're waiting for the second coming and thinking, which we will discuss in another post, we are not saying, I'm not a preterist, and I am not saying that this meant that Jesus' second coming and everything happened in 70 AD when they were judged. That's not what I'm saying. So let's not misinterpret my words or put words into my mouth. I am not saying that. I am not a preterist. But I do like studying the actual Greek. Not that I am a Greek scholar, but I do like studying the actual Greek and comparing it and trying to know what I am talking about before I tell someone an error that the editors in English may have made. That's all. Bye.